Hey YouTube, I'm Ross Stewart with Stewart Media Digital, and welcome to the new studio space. It is still a work in progress, but let me know what you guys think. Anyway, we're here today to talk about the Sigma 35mm f1.2 prime lens for the Sony E Mount system. Now, I recently made a video on my very first shoot with this lens, taking environmental portraits. So if you want to see a hands-on review, be sure to check that out. I rented this lens for 2 weeks through aperturant.com. Link in the description box below. I had a really good experience with them, so if you're interested in renting gear, they're definitely a good place to do that. But anyway, so now I've had the lens and I've taken a few thousand shots with it. So I want to really take a deep dive into this lens and talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. At the standard range of 35mm, with that 1.2 maximum aperture, this lens is really versatile. It's going to be great for environmental portraits. It's got a great minimum focus distance, so you can even step in and get closer portraits, although a 35mm might not be the best option for that in every situation. It is also going to be great for landscapes and cityscapes. It's going to be great for street photography, nighttime street photography, low light photography in general. With that 1.2 aperture, it's going to let in a lot of light. I wish I had had the opportunity to test this out shooting a wedding. With everything going on, not shooting a lot of weddings this summer, unfortunately, but I think that this lens would be really great for that, and for corporate events, anything where you need low light performance, this lens is really going to thrive. The downside, however, though, is that it is really, really heavy. It is the biggest prime lens I've ever held in my hands, and it is really expensive, especially for a third-party lens. It is $1,500 US. So let's dive into all the good, all the bad, all the ugly, and see if this lens is the right lens for you. So first, let's talk about the build quality. I think Sigma did a really good job building a nicely built and aesthetically pleasing lens. It is an all-metal construction with some plastic elements and a magnesium alloy interior, which does add to the weight, unfortunately. Like I said, it is almost 2.5 pounds or 1,080 grams, which makes it definitely really heavy for a prime lens. It feels really front heavy, really unbalanced on all of Sony's cameras, but especially on an APS-C camera, it is ridiculous. It feels very, very front heavy, and it is very strange feeling to hold. And by the way, on an APS-C camera, it is a 52.5mm lens, so it goes from being a little bit wider to right in the middle of the standard range, which still makes it really versatile. So if you are an APS-C shooter, don't necessarily rule this lens out, but just be wary that it is going to be very heavy and very front heavy. Now let's talk about the focus ring. It is focused by wire like most lenses for the Sony mirrorless system, but I like this focus ring. It has a good amount of resistance. It's almost a little too stiff, if I'm being honest. But for precision focusing, it is really good. It has a good amount of resistance, and it does have a really long throw, which has positives and negatives. If you're trying to change focus quickly from close to infinity, you're gonna find yourself turning the ring for a long time. But with that 1.2 aperture, it can have a really razor thin depth of field. So if you want really precise focusing, that is a positive of having that long throw and all that resistance. So overall, I would say I do really like the focus ring on this lens. In addition to the focus ring, it also has a manual aperturing, which is kind of cool to see on a third-party lens. Some of my G Master prime lenses and my Sony Zeiss lenses have the manual aperture ring, and I personally have grown to really like them. Some people hate them, some people find them pointless, but I really like them. They fit into my shooting style well, so I'm really glad that Sigma included it on this lens. The focus ring goes from f1.2 to f16 with the ability to switch it over to auto, which has you control it on the back of the camera instead of through the manual ring itself. It also has a click-declick switch for video shooters. I personally never used this, But if you do want a smooth exposure transition, you can declick it and get smooth exposure transitions in video without those incremental jumps as if it were clicked. Next, on the side of the camera, it has an autofocus manual focus switch, which for an expensive lens seems like a no-brainer, but my Sony Zeiss 35 1.4 does not have an autofocus manual focus switch, and that drives me crazy. So I'm really glad that Sigma included that. Even though it seems obvious and seems like no big deal, it is really nice to have. Finally, on the side, it has an autofocus lock button, which is customizable to do pretty much anything else. I find there to be plenty of buttons on the back of the camera, so I never really use it. But if you do use it, it is still pretty cool to see them include it on a third-party lens. So kudos to Sigma for including that. It does come with a lens hood that seems a little bit cheap and plasticky compared to the build quality of the rest of the lens, but it's nice that they included it, and it seems like it's going to do the job just fine. And finally, on build quality, it is fully weather sealed, which again is really great to see on a third-party lens. It even has a rubber gasket in the back, so I believe them when they say it's weather sealed. Where I am in Texas, it hasn't rained since I've had this lens, so I haven't tested it out myself, but I would feel really confident taking this lens out in some light rain. Now let's talk about image quality. It has 17 elements in 12 groups for some really impressive sharpness. Even wide open at 1.2, the center of the image is incredibly sharp, with peak sharpness at about 2.8. 3 of those 17 elements are spherical elements, which does a really great job of cutting down on chromatic aberration. I noticed virtually none of it in any of my test images. In terms of image quality though, there are a couple of drawbacks to this lens. Wide open at 1.2, there is a lot of vignetting, at least a couple of stops. That can be really nice for some images where you're trying to pull in the focus to the center of the frame, but I would honestly rather do that in post than have the lens do that. It also has a good amount of barrel distortion. So definitely some things to be aware of. These things are fixable in post, but especially when you start pushing the ISO, trying to fix the vignetting in post can give you some really grainy, ugly edges of your frame. So definitely something to keep in mind. Next, this lens has Sigma's super multi-layer coating to reduce flaring and ghosting. And shooting in backlit situations, it does retain a good amount of contrast, but shooting directly into the sun makes the images pretty much unusable, but that's sort of to be expected from a super wide aperture lens like this, so I can't really complain. Next, let's talk about bokeh and subject separation, since that is one of the biggest reasons to buy this lens. It is a 35, so you're not going to necessarily always get the blurriest backgrounds. If you are further away from your subject, you're not going to get quite as much subject separation, but it does have a great minimum focusing distance of just under 1 foot or 30 centimeters. So you can step in and still create some really beautiful, creamy, out of focus backgrounds and get a lot of really nice bokeh. It does have an 11 rounded blade aperture, so the bokeh balls are really nice and round. And of course, like most lenses I've tested, it does have some cat eye bokeh around the edges, but it's really not too bad. And finally, about the aperture, that 1.2 is going to be great for low light situations. I mentioned at the beginning that I think that this lens would be really good for wedding photographers. Back when I shot Canon, I had the 51.2, and for low light, being able to use candle light as my main light source was really amazing. And I haven't been able to do that personally at weddings with this lens yet, but I think that this lens will be really good for that. So if you are primarily a wedding shooter, definitely consider this lens. Now let's talk about autofocus. Autofocus performance has been something that has kept me from buying third-party lenses for a long time. However, this lens I think does a really, really impressive job. I would say that it does about 90 to 95% as well as my Sony native 35mm 1.4 lens. I had a couple of minor issues throughout the several thousand images I shot with this lens, but for the most part, it works really, really well. It's really snappy, very reliable, and rack focuses in video with this lens look beautiful. They look really cinematic, and I think that this lens paired with my Sony A7 III and A7R III do a fantastic job with autofocus, to the point where if I didn't already have the Sony Zeiss 35mm 1.4, I may actually have picked up this lens instead. And another thing worth mentioning is that it does autofocus incredibly quietly. It has a hypersonic motor, so the autofocus is quick and silent. So even though I have mostly good things to say about this lens, it is really heavy and it is pretty expensive and has a couple of other minor issues. So let's compare it to a couple of its competitors to see if this is the right lens for you. First, let's compare it to the Sony Zeiss 35mm 1.4 lens. Now, I actually own that lens. I've done a couple reviews on it and have taken tens of thousands of shots with it over the last couple of years, and I do really like the Sony Zeiss. However, it is $100 more expensive, and the aperture is not quite as good at 1.4 as opposed to the Sigma's 1.2. It is quite a bit smaller and quite a bit lighter though, so if that is a major factor for you, the Sony Zeiss might be the way to go. It is still pretty large though, and there are smaller alternatives, but within this price range, if you really want that pro quality, these are definitely the two to consider. Next, let's compare it to Sigma's 35mm 1.4. That is also going to be a phenomenal lens. It does have some similar issues to this Sigma in terms of not quite as good autofocus, and the image quality is a little bit less, but it is only $650, so it is significantly cheaper. And even though I can be a little nitpicky about its performance, that is still a really fantastic lens. Sigma has not slacked at all for years. They've put out a lot of really great lenses. So if you're looking for a really great lens that is quite a bit cheaper, the Sigma 35 1.4 art lens might be the right choice for you. So now to wrap things up, I have been using this lens for about 2 weeks now, and I've taken a few thousand shots and I have really enjoyed it. It does have those couple issues, like it is really big and really heavy. If you are going to be shooting with this lens all day, you are gonna notice the size and the weight. The image quality though is really outstanding. The vignetting and the barrel distortion are some negatives, but the sharpness and the bokeh and the overall character of this lens are really impressive. If I didn't already own the Sony Zeiss 35 1.4, I would probably get this lens instead, so I definitely recommend it. And again, if you're interested in renting lenses, check out my link in the description box below. Aperturant is a great company for that. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe.